Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. I would like to start this episode off with a bit of a moment of silence for the Touch Bar MacBook Pro that has now been officially killed off. Okay, moment over. Apple held their Scary Fast event this week, and I have to say, one of the fastest things about the event was actually the speed. So I'm not sure if that's what they were going for, but it was a very, very quick event. They kind of blew through a bunch of stuff, and it was just overall very short. But we are getting a little bit ahead of ourselves here, because I want to take a second moment of silence for everyone's hopes and dreams that got absolutely shattered, which in a way, they never should have been shattered in the first place because it was a pipe dream all along. But of course, this being the idea that because the event's happening at night around Halloween, you know, these events always happen in the morning. Tim Cook always says good morning. What's he going to say? He obviously has to say good evening. So people, myself included, kind of got ourselves hyped up that I think we all knew deep down, of course, that this was never going to happen, but we're holding on to that slim sliver of hope that just maybe this could happen. And that, of course, being that Tim Cook would dress up like a vampire, Count Dracula or something like that, and say something like good evening in some kind of like Transylvanian style like vampire accent, you know? Of course, he didn't do that. He didn't say it in any kind of special accent or dress up as a vampire. So we kind of all got our hopes and dreams crushed right there. But you know, it was all in good fun. And it was definitely a twist hearing him say good evening rather than good morning. So we're going to get to that this week, but one thing that we're not going to be able to get into this week, but we're going to touch on next week that you're going to want to stay tuned for, is why game development is probably one of the best ways that you can learn not only software development, but computer science topics, cybersecurity, DevOps, and all kinds of good stuff in the IT realm just by writing and developing your own video game. So that's going to be coming up next week, so be sure to be subscribed to the podcast feed so you don't miss it, because I think that's going to be a good one. So let's get into this week's episode with the trivia question. So everyone knows that the famous MP3 player that Apple created was called the iPod. But not to be outdone, Microsoft created their own MP3 player to try to compete with Apple. What was the name of their MP3 player? So what was the name of Microsoft's MP3 player? And that is your trivia question for the week. Now, speaking of trivia, if you'll recall to last week's trivia question, which, spoiler alert, if you didn't listen to last week's episode, the answer to the trivia question last week was a man-in-the-middle attack, or of course this idea being that, you know, you and say your friend are sending data back and forth and someone intercepts the data in flight and either, you know, makes a copy of it, steals your information, manipulates it, you know, whatever. So man-in-the-middle attack. So that was the trivia question for last week, and I had one of you fellow assassins reach out to me and say you couldn't remember the name, the specific, you know, terminology. So you said shenanigans, and I have to say that definitely put a smile on my face, because I will say you're not wrong. you are totally right, because when a man-in-the-middle attack is going on, there are some serious shenanigans going on. So if I were a professor or teacher of computer science and that was one of my exam questions and you turned in shenanigans as the answer, I honestly could not in good faith give you a 0 for that question, because like I said, you're not wrong, right? It's not the answer I was looking for, but at the same time, you are not wrong. You are indeed correct. Now, I guess it would probably depend what kind of mood I was in that day, as far as what I would do as far as grading it. But I'd probably give somewhere in the range of maybe up to a half a point or something like that. But yeah, definitely that was pretty great. So with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So for this week's cybersecurity tip, we're going to be continuing the theme of being safe when you download software from the internet. So not all, but a good number of reputable software distributors or software developers or whatever the case may be, they will give you a hash of their executable, their installer, whatever it is. And this is really important because last week and even this episode, we talked about man-in-the-middle attacks. So if you download, say, a installer from some website and you want to make sure that there was no man-in-the-middle attack happened or someone hijacked, the website and poisoned the download link or whatever, one way you can verify that you indeed have the piece of software that the developer intended is by doing a cryptographic checksum of the piece of software that you downloaded and comparing it to what they have posted on their website. And if those checksums are different, then you have a little bit of a problem. So ideally, they should always be the same. But if they're not the same, there's a couple things that could happen. One, like I mentioned, the download link or something could have been hijacked or compromised. There could have been a man-in-the-middle attack that, some threat actor injected some malicious code into the executable in flight. The developer or the company or whatever could just be lazy and they forgot to update their checksum. That probably happens a lot more than you think. So there's a couple of different ways that it could happen, but it's just one way to give yourself a little bit of added security. Now, I should mention that just because the checksums match does not mean that piece of software you downloaded is free from any kind of malware, right? Because I could write a Trojan program or a worm or some kind of ransomware or whatever, and I could, do a cryptographic checksum of it and put it, alongside the big green download link. And of course, if you download it, run the checksum, of course it's going to match because I ran the checksum on the malware that I wrote. So obviously, just because your checksum matches doesn't mean your executable or zip file or whatever you downloaded is malware free. But it's one of those things, we talk about the Swiss cheese approach to security. It's just another layer of Swiss cheese. Yeah, there's some pretty big holes in it, but it also does protect you from, things like man-in-the-middle attacks from happening. So at the very least, you downloaded the piece of software that the person providing that software intended for you to download. So doing cryptographic checksums, another tool to add into your toolbox, another piece of Swiss cheese to add to your layers of Swiss cheese defenses. So that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. And before we get into nerdy things, something that's kind of it's not going to sound related at all, but trust me, it is tangentially related to things we talk about on this podcast. Now, my day job sent me, well, not me personally. It's one of those like corporate blast emails that that you get, and half the time you kind of just ignore them anyway. Don't do that though. You should totally read those emails. But anyway, the email was titled 10 Easy Ways to Reduce Your Carbon Footprint. And the reason why I bring this up was there was a key point in there that I wanted to touch on, and that being that one should keep their house at 78 degrees in the summertime. Yeah, that's going to be a hard pass. I think you guys have heard me talk enough on the podcast about how sweltering hot my upstairs can be, which granted, part of that is my own fault for running a data center upstairs. So, I mean, it's basic, high school physics, I guess, maybe even middle school, that heat rises, right? So in the summertime, the upper levels of your house are going to be warmer than the lower levels. That's just, physics, right? Now, if you're dumping even more heat higher up, maybe like you're running a data center or something in your upstairs spare bedroom, that's just going to make it even hotter up there. So yeah, I don't think my data center would appreciate those warm temperatures. And the reason why I say this is, I don't know how much I've mentioned it before. I think I did one time. During the kind of early to mid-fall / mid to late springtime, you have those days where it's like kind of cold in the morning or cool in the morning, but then it gets warm in the afternoon. It's those days where you don't really know what you're supposed to wear to work or to school, because in the morning you have to wear like a jacket or something and maybe some pants, but by the end of the day you're wearing shorts and a t-shirt. And it's these kinds of days where early, like throughout the night and whatever, things cool down, so your house cools down. But then during the day, things heat up, but not to the point that your AC kicks on. And these, honestly, are even worse than, like, heat of the summer, 100 degrees out. Because at least when it's 100 degrees out, the AC is basically running all the time to keep the house cool. So upstairs and downstairs are more or less kind of, in the it's not like you go from upstairs to downstairs and you feel like you walked into a different climate. But during, the time of year where the AC like really doesn't kick on or infrequently kicks on, I've noticed ballpark a 10-degree Fahrenheit temperature differential between the downstairs and the upstairs. So we're talking like, usually I keep my house like in the summer around like 74-ish. So upstairs will sometimes get into the mid 80s, which I don't know if you've ever tried to sleep in a house in the mid 80s, but it is pretty rough. Now, obviously, this is like a major first world problem, obviously, but still, it's not exactly a comfortable experience. So now push that to close to 90. Yeah, that's going to be a hard pass for me, because the AC would take even longer to kick on, with it getting up to 78 if I actually had my house set to that. So, upstairs would be pretty darn close to 90, which is kind of unlivable. And that's just not my own opinion. Actually, my day job has a similar opinion, because there was a time, I don't remember when it was. I think it was this summer, or maybe it was last summer. I don't remember, but sometime in the semi-recent history, the AC at the office broke. So it was over 90 degrees in the office, and they literally told everyone to go home. So if 90 degrees is not a suitable work environment, I don't think I think it's safe to say 90 degrees in your house is not a suitable living environment if we're going by these same standards here. So yeah. Now, I hear some of you saying, well, if your house and the upstairs get so darn hot, why don't you just close all the vents on the main level and force all the cold air upstairs? And I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's something I have neglected to mention, because I already do that. Because I thought about that, because I used to not do that, and doing that actually significantly helped. Like, I'm talking, we got to the point sometimes where upstairs was actually cooler than downstairs. Of course, then the AC would turn off, and then it would kind of flip again. But again, that doesn't really do you any good if the AC isn't running on a semi-frequent basis. Now, that's the first half of it. The second half was, they mentioned that you should keep your house at around 67 in the wintertime. Now, personally for me, in the wintertime, the past few years at least, I've kept my house, we'll just say, a decent amount cooler than that. So I guess you could say I'm making up for the fact that I run my house cooler than they would like in the summertime by running it significantly cooler in the wintertime. So, kind of balances out there. But, big but here. The thing that I noticed they made no mention of was running your own data center at your house. They said absolutely nothing about running a data center in your own house. So obviously I am totally in the clear here. Running a data center in my house that draws, around like 400 watts just sitting there idling, doing nothing. Definitely perfectly good, A-OK for the environment. No harm, no foul here. All good. So obviously I'm making a little bit of light here, because I think it's safe to say that your average person does not have a data center drawing 400 watts at idle in their house. I think it's safe to say the average person does not have that. Now, obviously, if you polled the Dark Assassins podcast listener, you might not necessarily get those results, but obviously we are a very biased group here. I would assume by you listening, you are of a similar mindset as me and enjoy things like homelabbing and developing software for your home lab and integrating, these enterprise systems and all that good stuff. And you probably have a home lab of your own. But I would assume just the general population probably doesn't fall into that category. So them putting that on there as a top 10 tip wouldn't really apply to most people. So that is probably just an oversight on their part. But anyway, that aside, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So I got back to some video game programming. I've been kind of working on this, chipping away at it the past couple weeks, still working on the same battle scene. And I know it probably sounds like I'm making pretty slow progress on this since I talk about it every single podcast for the past couple weeks. But in all reality, well, first off, I think I mentioned it. I don't have any kind of game engine for this development. My development of the scene is literally write some code, compile, run, see what it looks like, exit the program, change some code, recompile, run, see what it looks like. So obviously very inefficient. But in addition to that, I've mentioned it many times, graphics is not my strong suit. When it comes to my programming abilities. So obviously, if you're trying to work on something that you're not that good at, it's going to take you a lot longer to do than something you are good at. So I guess one example for software developers, I guess, if you're a seasoned veteran, iterating through an array is probably going to be pretty darn simple and trivial, and you'll finish that in a couple seconds. But if you've never written code before in your life, it's probably going to take you a little while to be able to iterate through that array. So similar thing here. Graphics, again, not my strong suit, so it's kind of taking me a little to get through it. But also, generally, it's not like I've been spending, I get home from work and then basically until I go to bed, I'm working on this thing. That's generally not the case. It's like maybe I'll spend like a couple hours like on one day. Some days I don't do anything. So pretty much just trying to find it in my overall schedule. But the other reason why I didn't finish this or whatever is because I got sidetracked onto another project like I always do. So this week I decided to work on a new project and basically have software development meets home lab and like a perfect marriage, because one thing I've talked about on the podcast before is Wake on LAN, which if you're not familiar with what Wake on LAN is, it's basically a way that you can have a computer in a powered off state, but if you have it, plugged into power and connected through Ethernet or potentially even over Wi-Fi too, you can wake the device up like you had some kind of lights out management feature like enterprise servers have. Now, obviously, Wake on LAN is a lot more limited than, say, IPMI, which is what all the enterprise gear uses to allow you to remotely access and manage them. But Wake on LAN is kind of a primitive way. Now it is, I guess I'll say it is vendor specific. So the BIOS and whatnot actually has to support Wake on LAN. So not every system supports it, but it's a fairly common feature. But the other thing too is it may or may not be enabled. So it's one thing that you'd have to check in your system's BIOS. But one thing I decided to do was I thought it would be cool to make an iOS app that would be able to send these Wake on LAN magic packets and be able to wake my servers up by, just from my phone without even having to, remotely log into a server or access my pfSense interface to send a Wake on LAN packet or pick up a computer to use my Server Connect program to send a Wake on LAN packet. I can just do it from my phone. And one thing I've noticed, if you'll recall back a few months ago, I wrote a universal countdown app to, track, time till an event happens or whatever. And I noticed that in addition to writing an iOS app for that, I also wrote a command line based app for Windows, Mac, and Linux. And I noticed that when I don't have that app installed on my phone, I rarely ever use it. I rarely ever go and use the command line program to see, the countdown timer. But when I had it on my phone, I was checking it, semi-frequently just because the convenience factor. So that was part of the reason why it's a lot easier to just, whip up my phone and press a button on my phone than have to, go to a computer, log in, navigate to the directory and run the command, right? Obviously, that's not a whole lot of work, but again, you've heard some of the things that I've automated for myself because how lazy I can be at times. But at the same time, automation is just fun. But anyway, getting back on track here. So actually, to my surprise, I pretty much was able to create an MVP in a single day. And by MVP, I'm not referring to most valuable player, of course. I'm referring to the minimum viable product. And when I say minimum, I mean bare minimum. um, and but the reason I think I was kind of surprised was I don't do a whole lot of Swift development. And of course, Swift being the main programming language used for iOS apps. Now, I think you can technically still use Objective-C, but Apple is really pushing Swift. Anyway, I don't do a whole lot of Swift development. I've talked about it in previous episodes of the podcast, but basically the long and the short of it is, because I don't have a paid developer account, I can't keep the apps on my phone for more than a week, and I don't really feel like having to always reinstall the apps every week onto my phone just to have them. So it kind of decreases the desirability to create iOS apps, in my personal opinion. But anyway, that's kind of here nor there. But anyway, back to creating the app. So when I say minimum viable product, it's functional. And that's basically about it. So it's not pretty. It's very much lacking some very much needed quality of life features. And I guess there is a little bit of a step up here, because while it's lacking a ton of quality of life features, it's not so bad to the point that if you want to send a Wake on LAN packet send it to one device and then you want to send another one to a different device, at least you don't have to recompile and rebuild the app onto the phone. So we at least made it a step above there. But again, I think that's kind of like bare minimum. If you're anything that you're trying to deliver that can do something like, Wake on LAN, or some kind of the ability to, in a way, I guess, configure things, you shouldn't make it that the user has to recompile your program every time they want to change one of those settings. So just a tip out there for any developer out there. Now, obviously, for testing, it's not necessarily a huge deal, but obviously when it comes to actually delivering the product, having to recompile it and re-edit the code every time you want to change a configuration like that is not ideal. So anyway, so that's why I say it is at minimum viable product status. But it is roughly working in the sense that I am able to add devices, and I'm able to wake them up by sending the magic packets. I did test that. But there's some basic validity checking to make sure that the MAC address and IP address is valid. And yes, I said IP address, not multicast address. Hi there, Dark Assassin from the future, and I made a little bit of an oopsie here. You heard me refer to IP and multicast address. That should have been broadcast address. Wake on LAN uses broadcast, not multicast, so you'll have to excuse me. Although I do get into why I wasn't able to send messages over, I say multicast, but really it should be broadcast. And that still applies, being that you still need to have this flag set in your developer account to enable both multicast and broadcast. But yeah, so when you hear me referring to Wake on LAN using multicast, that's an error on my part. Should be broadcast. Anyway, back to the episode. Which technically they're the same thing in the sense that if a valid IP address is a valid multicast address, because they refer to the same system of being they have to be between 0 and 255. But we covered that in a previous episode. But the reason I say IP address is because apparently Apple decided that in order to be able to use multicast on iOS apps, you one have to be a paid developer, and then somewhere in your like account settings for your paid developer status, there's like a flag or something that you have to check in order to basically say that you are able, that the apps that you make are able to use multicast. I don't know. It's kind of weird. Not exactly sure why they decided to do that. But that took me a few hours of troubleshooting. Honestly, so out of all the time I've spent so far working on this app, I would say probably close to, if not more than half of the time developing this app was trying to figure that out. Like I could, for the life of me, could not figure out why sending a multicast address message, or essentially blasting out this Wake on LAN message to everything on the local area network or the LAN, was not working, and I wasn't getting any kind of send status or anything like that. And yeah, it literally was that simple. It was, I didn't have a paid developer account with the flag checked, basically. So there was a few hours of troubleshooting. So I guess word of the wise to anyone trying to develop a similar app, you're probably not going to be able to do it. But in fairness, the IP address solution is not ideal, but at least kind of works, at least in my use case, because in my home lab, pretty much every device, especially every hardware-based device, has its own statically assigned IP address. So if I send a Wake on LAN packet to a specific IP address, it's going to get to where it's supposed to go anyway. So it doesn't really matter if I do a broadcast address through multicasting, or if I just send it directly to the host. So either way, it's going to get there because I'm using static IPs. But if you don't have static IP addresses, that's where you're going to run into problems, because you could be trying to send this Wake on LAN packet to host A, but host A's IP address that you think you're sending it to is not actually host A's IP address. It's something else, so you're not actually getting there. So it could be a problem, which is why in actual Wake on LAN, pieces of software that perform this don't use the actual IP address of the device themselves. They just send it out to every device, and if the device has that MAC address, it'll wake up, assuming it has Wake on LAN turned on. So yeah. Now I mentioned it doesn't have all of it's severely lacking some quality of life features. One of those being the ability to edit a device that you added. So like I mentioned, this is IP based, and so if you enter the IP wrong, you would need to edit it. And of course, the developer of this Wake on LAN app that I'm telling you about, in all their genius, decided that if you want to edit the device, you totally can. You just have to delete it first, and then you can re-add it. Or you could just add another one that's the exact same. Yeah, like I said, it's severely lacking some quality of life features. But we're in the initial, this is why I say minimum viable product. Like, it functions, and that's about it. It achieves the goal that it's supposed to, but it's not pretty and polished and in a good looking state. But, one day's worth of development trying to throw something together, I'm fairly happy with where it's at. Now, I am planning on adding that ability for to be able to edit the connection or device once you actually create it. But I decided that at 12:30 a.m. on a day that I have to get up in the morning for work, we're gonna wait for another day. We're gonna do this later, because as I mentioned, a lot of that time was spent trying to figure out that the reason why I couldn't send multicast was because I wasn't a paid developer with a flag. So yeah, fun times being developing for Apple devices. Now, speaking of Apple devices, Apple held an event this week where they revealed some new devices. No iPhones or anything like that. This was a strictly Mac-focused event. And one thing that I thought was pretty cool was they totally went with the Halloween theme. Like, there were Halloween vibes all through that keynote event, which was pretty cool to see. And obviously, like I mentioned in the beginning of the podcast, Tim Cook with his good evening rather than good morning, definitely a headline. So I guess we can just dive right in to this event. So they started out, of course, unveiling the new chips that are gonna be powering these new MacBooks. So they unveiled their M3, M3 Pro, and M3 Max chips. Of course, they're all running on a 3-nanometer process, just like the A17 Pro. And here's where some of the interesting things come into play. So their GPU architecture, they kind of revamped it, and they added this thing called dynamic caching into their graphics architecture. So basically, what this means in a nutshell is that memory gets allocated in hardware in real time, rather than seeing what the peak demand of the memory would need to be and then allocating all of that at once and then just kind of holding it there. So basically what this allows you to do is better manage and utilize your GPU memory. And of course, when you're dealing with unified memory, or the memory on the system is shared between the CPU and the GPU, and especially with how stringent Apple is with their memory, you want to be able to manage that as best as possible. So this should see some pretty good improvements there. And then they added some additional hardware level things like mesh shading for different graphics-based things. And then, of course, hardware-accelerated ray tracing, which, again, was something that came to the A17 Pro back in, I guess, September at the iPhone event. So Apple is touting 2.5 and 1.8 times faster graphics rendering compared to the M1 and M2, respectively. So definitely a pretty solid boost in the GPU performance. And when it comes to the CPU performance, Apple is touting fairly significant gains in both the performance cores and the efficiency cores. And they are also touting that these new chips have the same performance as an M1 at half the power of an M1 series chip, which, if you know how power efficient the M1 series chips are, that's pretty incredible, because the M1 series chips, when they were brand new, were basically absolutely destroying everyone in the industry when it came to performance per watt, or how much performance you can get for how much power you draw. So being able to have the same exact performance as an M1 series chip, which already was fairly low in terms of how much power they drew, and being able to do that at half that power is pretty impressive. So we'll have to see once the reviews come out exactly how much of a performance increase we'll see. Apple, I think, was touting anywhere between 30% to 50%, sometimes even 20%, 15%. There was a different variances of range, but overall a pretty decent jump in as far as chip performance goes. Another thing that they also added was a faster neural engine and also AV1 decoding for hardware encoding and decoding for media encoders. So that's pretty nice to see. And they touted up to 11 times faster than the fastest Intel MacBook Pro. Now, while that does sound very, very impressive, I'm not trying to downplay it at all. I think we all can probably see what Apple is comparing here. Most likely, they're probably comparing, of course, they're saying the fastest Intel-based MacBook Pro, so I think that's pretty obvious that they're referring to the i9 series 16-inch MacBook Pro. And when they say it's 11 times faster than that, I would assume they're probably referring to the maxed out M3 Max chip. That would kind of be my assumption. But nonetheless, I mean, that is pretty significant. And Apple definitely made it a point in this keynote targeting us holdouts that are still rocking Intel-based machines. I guess they're really trying to get everyone off Intel so they can just kill it off, which shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, the past few WWDCs, we've seen the Intel-based Macs drop like flies. They've been dropping really quick. As far as how much time's left for the Intel-based machines, I remember, I don't remember when it was, but I remember I gave kind of like a guesstimate on when the last Intel-based machine would be dropped, and my estimate was it would be the 2019 Intel-based MacBook Pro, or not MacBook Pro, Mac Pro. And seeing that it came out in 2019, looking at probably like 8 to 9 years of software support based on previous Mac Pros, that would put you around like maybe 2027, since they're trying to kill all these off so quickly. But I guess we'll see what happens. But yeah, they definitely made it a point to try to encourage those of us that are still on Intel-based machines to upgrade to the new MacBooks. So getting into the more specifics as far as the chips go, we'll go through this pretty quick since Apple went through this insanely quick. The M3 has up to an 8-core CPU with 4 performance and 4 efficiency cores, up to a 10-core GPU, and up to 24 gigs of RAM. Of course, those up to numbers being very important because that's obviously not where it starts. Similarly, the M3 Pro has up to a 12-core CPU, and one thing that was rather peculiar about the M3 Pro was it has 6 performance and 6 efficiency cores, which is rather interesting because last year and the year before, I believe it was 8 and... I don't remember. I think last year was 8 and 2. I don't remember what the M1 series was. But regardless, it was more performance than efficiency cores. So it is a little interesting that they're going equal with the performance and efficiency cores. Now, obviously, I think it's pretty safe to say that there's going to be a performance improvement over, obviously, the M1 Pro and even the M2 Pro. But I do think it's a kind of an interesting move to see this, equal performance versus efficiency compared to, because it's kind of different than what they've done in past years. But anyway, that also has up to an 18-core GPU and up to 36 gigs of RAM, an interesting choice. But it gets even more interesting when we get to the low end of that chip, which we'll get to in a little bit here. And then the M3 Max has up to a 16-core CPU with 12 performance and 4 efficiency cores. Now, this is also the first year that there's actually a difference as far as the CPU SKUs go between the Pro chip and the Max chip. So last year with the M2 and even before that the M1, both the M1 Pro and M1 Max and the M2 Pro and the M2 Pro or M2 Max, their CPUs were basically identical. They had the same number of performance and efficiency cores and the same number of total cores. So if you tried to do so basically before you were only getting the Max if you needed the additional GPU horsepower because the CPU power was going to be exactly the same since it's the same CPU. But that obviously changes this year, and the M3 Max has up to a 40-core GPU and 128 gigabytes of RAM. Whew, that is going to cost you a very pretty penny, but it's cool that they offer it, I guess. So as far as the new Max, so I mentioned at the top of the episode that the Touch Bar MacBook Pro is officially dead. It is being replaced with a 14-inch MacBook Pro. So the 14-inch MacBook Pro now starts with an M3 chip, and the base configuration is an 8-core CPU, 10-core GPU, 8 gigs of RAM, RIP, and 512 gigs of SSD storage. So yeah, that they're still keeping with 8 gigs. It's 2023, and these computers will be around into 2024, and we're still dealing with 8 gigs of RAM. Oh boy. Anyway, on to the higher end SKUs. So the 14-inch and 16-inch with the M3 Pro. Basically the same as previous years as far as specs go, aside from the CPUs, of course. So they start with an 11-core CPU, 14-core GPU, and here's where that interesting number comes in: 18 gigs of RAM as the base amount, and 512 gigs of SSD storage. So yeah, 18 gigs of RAM. I don't think I've really ever seen a computer with that kind of RAM configuration. Like, the only time that I've ever seen anything kind of resembling that is when you see one of those like computers where whoever owned it just kind of haphazardly threw in whatever RAM they had, and it was all like mismatched and everything, and that's how they got to 18. That's kind of what I think when I see this number, 18 gigs of RAM. But I guess on the one hand, it is nice that you're getting an extra 2 gigs of RAM for what it's worth. But yeah. Oh, also, I guess one thing I should point out, going back a little bit to the 14-inch with the M3. So on the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pros, they have on the one side they have the MagSafe port and then the Thunderbolt ports, and on the other side they had the HDMI port, Thunderbolt, and SD card slot. So that's the same for the Pro and the Max chips, but on the base, I guess the base 14-inch MacBook Pro, the one with the M3 chip, on that side with the HDMI port, SD card slot, you lose that additional Thunderbolt 4 port. So just one thing to point out there. And then as far as the 14-inch and 16-inch with the Max chip, so it starts with a 14-core CPU, 30-core GPU, and 36 gigs of RAM. Again, another kind of interesting number, and a terabyte of SSD storage. Aside from that, basically the same, except the MacBook Pros with the Pro and the Max version of the M3 get a new color called Space Black, which I have to be honest, when I initially saw it in the keynote, my color blindness just thought it was just space gray, but maybe a touch darker. But then when they actually showed it, like in actual, they're like kind of baked in commercial things that they do, like kind of showing off the machines being actually used by real people. It actually looks pretty darn slick and a very dark. It's not like a super black, but it's kind of like maybe like a matte black type thing. And they did say that they added some kind of special like coating or whatever to hopefully reduce fingerprints, which hopefully that's true, and it's not a complete fingerprint magnet like the Midnight Color M2 MacBook Air is. So hopefully that's good. And this Space Black does replace Space Gray in these upper level MacBook Pros. So as far as the pricing goes, they were so happy touting the reduced price of the 14-inch MacBook Pro, which in classic Apple fashion, I mean, you can't blame them, but at the same time, it's like, come on. Like, yeah, the starting price now is $1,599 compared to basically $2,000, but you're also getting the lowest end chip for that $1,599 rather than to get the Pro chip, you're still paying $2,000 anyway. So yeah, you can tout the lower price, but it's all marketing, right? It's all marketing. But anyway, it is cool to, that I guess that they dropped the price. Rip anyone that is a fan of the Touch Bar. And then the 16 MacBook Pro with M3 Pro starts at $2,499, and the M3 and the M3 Pro are available for order now, and the M3 Max was coming in November. And they also finally updated the iMac as well. Now, this is as far as I can tell, I think basically just the chip spec bump. So it starts with an 8-core CPU, an 8-core GPU, 8 gigs of RAM, and 256 gigs of SSD storage. So that's going to be a big oof for anyone in 2023 or 2024, maybe even 2025. I don't know how long they're going to keep the M3 version around. Starts at $12.99, and according to Apple, it's 2 times faster than the M1 version of the iMac Pro. But as much as I'm kind of hating on it here, I mean, it's definitely just, a quality upgrade. It's definitely a quality upgrade. Now, if you have an M1 based iMac, probably don't upgrade. And honestly, if you have if you have any Apple Silicon machine, probably just don't need to upgrade in general, I'd say, unless you're one of those people that's already making your machine sweat like crazy, and I think you know who you are in that case. But yeah, the biggest takeaway that I had from this event was how much they were pushing people on Intel Macs to upgrade. Because I can't tell you how many times they reference like X% faster than Intel, this much better battery life compared to Intel MacBook Pros, and all this stuff, like comparing it to Intel, which I have to say, obviously, I know that it's pure marketing just to get everyone off Intel onto Apple Silicon. I totally get that's kind of the driving force behind this. But at the same time, I do have to say, I am very appreciative that they are comparing their latest and greatest chips with Intel. Because yes, it's total marketing for them to sell more new Macs, and I get that. But at the same time, it's also appealing to you and me. I say you and me in the sense that I'm assuming, of course, that you are like me in the sense that we're not upgrading our phones and our computers and everything every single year or every other year. We generally tend to hold on to our technology and use it to the fullest and pretty much only upgrade it when it completely dies on us or loses software support, or sometimes if you're like me, you continue to use the devices well after their ended software support, but because they're still perfectly good working machines. And that's one thing I've touched on in the podcast before, right, is kind of some of the reviewers of tech products are out of touch because they compare last year's version to the new version, which it's cool, to see that difference in how much performance is gained or whatnot. But it doesn't really help us normal people as much when, we're rocking something from like 6 years ago and they're comparing the new thing to last year's thing, and we have absolutely no point of reference here. So I do appreciate the fact that while it is totally for marketing purposes, I do appreciate the fact that Apple is comparing the newest and latest and greatest stuff to Intel. So that while we might not have the last Intel-based system, we can see that we're, generations behind that last Intel-based system potentially, and this new stuff is this much faster than the latest Intel stuff, which we are even slower than, so it can kind of give us a point of reference for if we do decide to upgrade, how much gains we could see in our upgrade. So I do have to give them props for that. And it's something that I definitely do appreciate because, like I said, numbers that have no point of reference are just numbers and they're basically meaningless. So being able to tie some meaning to those numbers definitely helps us, kind of understand just how insane these new chips are and how powerful they are, and definitely how much of an improvement they will be over an Intel system if you're still rocking them like I am. All of my Macs are still Intel based. I have still yet to upgrade to an M1 or any kind of Apple Silicon based system. Although since now officially I don't have any Macs that are officially supported by Apple, maybe I might decide that maybe this is the year. I don't know. We'll see. The 3 nanometer process is definitely something that's kind of enticing to me, but I'm definitely going to wait and see once the benchmarks come in and once the performance metrics come in from reviewers and whatnot. Because in typical Apple fashion, even though they did a great job, in my opinion, referring back to Intel-based systems, in classic Apple fashion, they still had their super vague and ambiguous graphs like they love to do. So it's really hard to see specifically how good the new chips are. I mean, on paper, they seem like they're going to be fantastic, but it is, obviously the results are going to be cherry-picked to pick the best ones, so it will be interesting to see once the actual reviews come out. But the other thing that was really interesting about the event was how short it was. I kid you not, it was 30 minutes long. Like, when it ended, I was like, wow. Like, I was fully ready for them to try to do like a one more thing or have something else to talk about but then when Tim Cook is like, because they said like, back to you, Tim, and this was like around the 30-minute mark, and I was like, okay, they're going to transition to something else. And then when he said like, hope you have a great night or whatever, I was like, wait, they're done already? So it definitely was pretty short. The big rip for me of this event was no new Mac Mini. Since I was pretty bummed not to see a new Mac Mini, since I have to say, out of all the Macs that I've owned, as far as which ones I like the most, I think anyone that's listened to the podcast knows what my number one is. Long live the Xserve, of course. Is it practical? No. Is it loud? Yes. Am I going to use it for day-to-day tasks? Definitely not. But it's definitely just something that's super cool. But I would say that the Mac Mini is probably number 2, just because how much I've used it. And I think it's, out of all the Macs that I currently own, I think it's the one that I've had the longest, I want to say. I'm trying to remember when I got it. I've had it for probably at least close to 5 years now. Obviously, I got it used. But it was like the top spec, top of the line Mac Mini from 2012. And that might not sound significant, but this was in a weird time in Apple's history where the new Mac Mini, which at the time I don't think the 2018 Mac Mini had came out, or maybe it had just come out, I don't remember. But the newest Mac Mini was like the 2014 Mac Mini, and the highest end Mac Mini from 2012 was actually more powerful than the 2014 Mac Mini, because you could get a 2012 Mac Mini with a quad-core i7 in it, whereas I think there was i7s in the 2014 one, but they were only a dual core, so you didn't have as many cores. And yeah, and of course this was also in that time where Intel kind of stagnated, and there really wasn't much year-over-year performance gains. So the 2012 Mac Mini was pretty much the reigning champ when it came to Mac Minis. And even when the 2018 Mac Mini came out, the 2012 Mac Mini was basically on par with the base model M3, or not M3, i3 Mac Mini at the time. So you could either get the lowest spec 2018 Mac Mini, or you could get a 2012 Mac Mini. So that's just kind of goes to show you how kind of crazy the Mac Mini was back in the day. But I still have one, still rock it as kind of like my everyday computer, I guess, if you will. Like if I'm using a desktop computer, which it's pretty much always the Mac Mini. I don't use my Mac Pro a whole lot, mainly because of the power draw aspect, but also mainly I just use the Mac Pro if I want to do some like development-based work because of the horsepower it has. Because I'll tell you what, those 2 Xeons in there, while they do suck down the juice, they compile the code pretty quickly. Even though they're like, gosh, over a decade old, probably like 12 years old or something like that, like kind of old, but 24 threads is 24 threads, so it'll compile the code for you, compared to the Mac Mini that only has 4 cores and 8 threads, so it definitely doesn't compile as fast. But yeah, the Mac Mini, I guess that's probably why I kind of have a soft spot for it, was because how long I've had my Mac Mini and how much I've used it. And I've had some other Macs for a decent amount of time too, like the Mac that I'm currently recording this podcast on, the 2015 MacBook Pro, which is kind of like the king, or I guess was the king, maybe not so much anymore, but that one, it was kind of like my workhorse mostly through college and whatnot, the end of college and beginning of my professional career, and then basically once I, was out of college for the most part, I didn't necessarily need my computer to be super mobile, so I didn't really take the 15-inch MacBook Pro around as much, or the 2015 MacBook Pro, and kind of just mostly stuck to the Mac Mini since it's not like I'm going anywhere. And then I ended up getting the 2017 13-inch MacBook Pro, mainly just, it was largely for nostalgia reasons, which I'm not necessarily going to get into. Basically, I worked an internship that I had this computer, and it kind of gave me nostalgia vibes for that internship that I enjoyed, so that's basically why I got it. And because it's so much smaller and lighter than the 2015 MacBook Pro, I generally, if I'm going to travel somewhere, I'll just take that because it's more portable and light. And generally, I don't do necessarily a ton of development stuff when I'm out on the go, so I don't necessarily need the horsepower because yes, it has a newer chip, but no, it's not as powerful. But like I said, it's not necessarily something I need. But yeah, I'm not sure how we really got all on this tangent. Oh yeah, the fact that there is no Mac Mini, and I was getting sad, and then I was comparing all the Macs that I had. So yeah, but speaking of Apple, that is a good segue back to the trivia question, because if you'll recall, the trivia question did have to deal with Apple and their iPod. So for the trivia question this week, everyone, of course, knows the famous MP3 player created by Apple being called the iPod. But not to be outdone, Microsoft launched their own MP3 player to compete with Apple, and it was called what? Now, if you said the Zune, you are indeed correct. So the Microsoft MP3 player was called the Zune. And honestly, if you've never heard of this, I don't blame you. Personally, I have fond memories of the Zune, not because I ever owned one or have even used one, but back in high school, I had a guitar teacher that in his kind of basically you can do whatever you want for the rest of class type thing spiel, he mentioned listening to your tunes or something on your iPod Touch or Zune, and I had no idea what that was, and I thought it was funny, and then I realized, oh, it was a Microsoft product. Oh, cool. So yeah, the Zune. Bit of tech trivia there for you. And like I said at the top of this episode, you're definitely going to want to stay tuned for next week, where we're going to get pretty in-depth into some more software development, talking about why game development might just be the best way to learn not only software development, computer science, cybersecurity, DevOps, and pretty much all things IT. So definitely subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss that one. And if you have any questions about this episode or future episodes, feel free to shoot me an email at contact@darkassassins.com, or if you just have some kind of funny remark or something, maybe you didn't remember it was called the Zune, but you thought it was something else, you could send that to me too. That's of course down in the show notes below the link to the email. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.